All right, it's 6 minutes past the hour. Just wanted to say welcome, everyone. My name is Brian McPherson, faculty in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Utah. And I'm really, really pleased and honored to not only introduce, but to have served as Aaron's advisor for his master's thesis. Aaron finished two undergraduate degrees 2 years ago in 2018, one in applied mathematics, which has really been a key factor in the work that you're about to witness, so to speak, to listen about. And also, of course, in civil and environmental engineering, both degrees cum laude. And he's really, I will let he and his work speak for themselves this morning. The title of that work being Remotely Characterizing a Hyper-Local Point Source of Greenhouse Gas Emissions in a Dense Urban Environment Using Empirical Atmospheric Data. And that belies a little bit of the analysis, which was intensely mathematical, as you'll see. The data set that Aaron's assembled is turned out to be far more compelling than any of us, I think, anticipated. It's just been a real pleasure to watch this project evolve. Without further ado, Aaron, I will turn it over to you to defend your thesis.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. I'm happy to be given the opportunity to defend for you all and for my committee here. And so I think that probably the best way this will work is for me to go through the presentation, and then I do have slide numbers. So if you have questions on specific places, feel free to just write them down. And then we can figure out how to do a general Q&A afterward. But for the time being, here I go. Off I go. Share my screen. That's probably step one, huh? All right. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
You got it?
Yep, we got it.
Okay, cool. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Aaron Meyer, as Brian said. I am a master's student here at the University of Utah. Now, I know many of you have recently been wondering, Aaron, how do I remotely characterize a hyperlocal point source of GHG emissions in a dense urban environment using empirical atmospheric data? Well, hey, today's your lucky day, because that's exactly what I'd like to show you. So I fully realize how dense that title is, so let's break it down a little bit. First off, what are GHGs, greenhouse gases, and why do we care? Well, the general scientific consensus today is that human-caused greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide and methane are the leading factor in global climate change. So here we see that graphically. As CO2 concentration increases, so has the global temperature. And so we set out to study these gases and how they interact with the environment. Now, the more we know about how GHGs interact with the environment, the better we can evaluate solutions to our climate change problem. So this makes accounting for GHGs an interest of policymakers and regulators, and can carry economic implications as well as more carbon tax and cap and trade systems are implemented. Now, while emphasis is often placed on larger global and country scales, accounting efforts are important on all scales because these smaller scale quantifications are what build national estimates. So here's an example of a city level accounting program in Los Angeles. Now, how is GHG flux characterized? Let's take a look at this project from Los Angeles as an example. This project uses a bottom-up inventory approach. So it estimates CO2 emissions using proxies like energy use, traffic volume, land use data at each of these grid cells to account for GHGs. Another widely studied accounting method uses computational fluid dynamics to create physics-based simulations. These models can range in scale from global atmospheric models like this one from NASA, showing atmospheric CO2 concentrations, to smaller scale pollutant dispersion models like this one of downtown Hanover, Germany. And here at the University of Utah, the Environmental Fluid Dynamics Lab actually works extensively on these types of numerical simulations. So finally, we enter the land of empirical data. This accounting method uses environmental observations, which can take all sorts of forms. We'll focus here on ground or tower-based atmospheric monitoring, which measures GHGs and other weather data from ground or building-based stations. The University of Utah also has ongoing research in this field through the Atmospheric Science Department, which monitors GHG concentration levels in the Salt Lake Valley using both stationary and mobile stations. This screen cap is from the department's open access site showing this data. Now, just like how those global inventories are built on local and state estimates, these sensor networks are really only as reliable as their building blocks, which in this case are the single atmospheric stations making up the network. So if we zoom into the local level, we can see where many of these stations are placed. Here we can see a station on the roof of WBB here at the University of Utah, which collects CO2 and CH4 methane data, along with other weather variables. We'll focus mostly on the wind. So these measurements allow for characterization of how air is moving and the GHG constituents present at the monitoring station. Now, unfortunately, while these single stations are the bones of this broader monitoring network, they're plagued by uncertainties due to the complex environment. Turbulence is an easy scapegoat for this uncertainty. In general, atmospheric theory tells us that higher up, provided the correct conditions, more stable air movement patterns can be exhibited. But as we approach the ground, a boundary layer and still closer, this turbulent roughness layer are found. And these atmospheric layers show high instability as these chaotic eddies make for very unpredictable airflow patterns. So adding to the complexity of the environment are these heterogeneous and varied sources and sinks of GHGs on the hyperlocal scale. So in the case of our environment on campus, these can be constituted by roads or parking lots, as well as some larger point sources of GHGs. This is where Dr. McPherson's keen eye noticed a point source many years ago in the form of this Panda Express restaurant vent, which sits on top of the Student Union here at the University of Utah. This vent emits high levels of CO2 and CH4 laden cooking gases from the hoods. So naturally, the smell of orange chicken drew me in, and here we are 2 years later with me finally pulling my head out of this vent. And so let's look at what happens when one of your sensors is placed in the vicinity of a hyperlocal source like this. Well, suppose the WBB building wasn't available and we needed to put a sensor here on the Union with the Panda Express vent. So when this is the case, multiple studies have shown that these large point sources have a direct impact on the data collected in the form of intense concentration spikes. So we can see that illustrated here as the data collected from the tower near the source shows this daily trend of CO2, but is quite noisy and has these large spikes and impulses periodically. So how are these often dealt with? Well, some studies use directional filtering or these broad averaging schemes to try to characterize larger trends of GHGs. Still other studies use baseline concentration and examine trends exhibited in data once this so-called noise has been filtered out. But our study seeks to dive into this noise and these spikes and see if we can extract any useful information from what's often filtered out in larger scale studies. Our hypothesis was that these hyperlocal point sources could be remotely characterized using simple variables like GHG concentration and wind velocity. And our studies find that this often filtered noise contains valuable information about the source. So of course, accomplishing this goal just boils down to 3 easy steps. First, we collect data from the point source and positions around it using different atmospheric monitoring instruments. Next, we create a model from the data. This helps us visualize the relationships between CO2 or methane concentration, and wind speed and direction. Don't worry, everyone, I will get more into the statistics, as I'm sure that's why you all tuned in for a statistics lecture. Finally, we can interpret the model both visually and quantitatively, and we can then use these interpretations to go back and alter different model parameters and see what methods and procedures work best for characterizing the source. Okay, well, I added a few steps, but let's start with number 1, and that, of course, is looking at the vent itself. So in order to effectively check our methods, we need to know how much CO2 is coming out of this thing just by measuring its outlet point. Doing this was actually not a trivial task because checking our results directly was difficult. And so to investigate, we built some bench scale models. This allowed us to recreate the Panda Express vent in a few sizes with directly measured CO2 input. So as CO2 is let out of this canister, the scale records the mass change. This CO2 then flows into the bottom of a vent with an annular shape and is blown upward, much like its rooftop counterpart. So in this way, we could directly compare our quantification methods with the directly measured mass flow rate reported by the scale. So I'm going to skip over the gory details of this section just to keep the presentation moving along. I'll happily circle back with more explanation of these bench scale experiments afterward. Generally, our studies found that if the pollutant, so CO2 in this case, is well mixed in the vent and the velocity leaving the vent is fairly stable in time, we can use continuous point measurements of just concentration and velocity to quantify the mass flow rate from the vent at any given time. Now, the result is this monitoring scheme seen here. By measuring the velocity shown in blue and the concentration shown in green, we can estimate the mass flow rate of CO2 leaving the Panda Express vent continuously as shown in red. So this tells us that at night, the vent is off, the velocity is 0, and during the day, we have these variable emissions as the stoves are operating. Okay, so with our vent quantified, we looked to collect data remotely in a few different places on the roof using different types of instrumentation. The first of these is called an eddy covariance system, which is seen here mounted atop a tower on the roof of the Union. This tower collects CO2, methane, water vapor, and 3-directional wind velocity data at a very fast data rate, 10 data points per second, or 10 hertz. These eddy covariance systems are an industry standard in these types of flux studies, but they come at a hefty cost, this and others costing upwards of $100,000 or more. So because of the high cost of these eddy covariance systems, we also set out to investigate how well a low-cost sensor tower would function in its ability to characterize the source. So here we see that in action. You can see the Panda Express vent in the background there. And inside this tower is perhaps what you'd expect the guts of a low-cost graduate student project to look like. It contains 3 spectrometers, which measure CO2 concentration in a vertical column on the tower, and a simple cup and vein anemometer, as well as a thermometer on top of the tower. Data from these instruments can easily be logged to an SD card using a basic Arduino interface. This interface could be eventually used to broadcast data to a broader network as well. Okay, so once our collection systems were functional, they're deployed to the roof, and we collected data concurrently at all 3 stations from August 15th to November 27th of 2019, moving both towers to different locations, as you can see in the figure here. And just like that, it's the end of 2019, and we've collected our data. So now it's time to build a model. So we'll start with some basic data processing. This involves extensive time corrections, filtering out unreasonable values, resampling the data, calculating wind direction. And a very important step in this data processing method relates back to this concept of noise and spikes that we think originate from the source itself. So because we're most interested in the elevated levels above these normal daily fluctuations, we examine what I call an excess concentration. So using a rolling minimum baseline shown here in black, we can remove these broader daily trends, and this allows us to focus on this excess concentration. So those spikes and the noise that are above the baseline and we think emanate primarily from our source. So once we've completed these pre-processing steps, we enter the world of statistic visualization. Let's start with a basic windrows diagram. This diagram splits wind directions and speeds into bins and plots them using polar coordinates. You can think of this as a kind of circular histogram that represents the speed and direction from which wind most often blows, in this case, the southeast and west-northwest generally. So we can then extend this idea into what's called a bivariate polar plot. Now, this operates much like a windrows, where we have wind directions binned into delta thetas and wind speeds binned into delta u's. Once these bins are established, concentrations can be represented as a function of the wind. So each bin of wind speed and direction holds the associated concentration values, which allows us to visualize their associated statistics. This plot shows the 95th percentile concentration of excess CO2 at each wind speed and direction bin. The result is this plot showing these hot spots. These hot spots represent the wind speed and direction, which have the highest associated concentration, 95th percentile concentrations. In other words, we think that a hotspot like this shows the direction of a large source. Okay, let's come back up out of the statistics hole. So far, we've collected data, we've built a model using data processing and statistical visualization. Let's leave machine learning briefly for now and see what we can find out using these statistical results. So we'll first focus on the position at Tower 1, which is about 37 meters east of the vent. If we plot the 95th percentile of raw CO2 values, it shows we have this broad range of potential source directions, primarily from the west all the way up to the north. However, if we create a similar plot, this plot here is using just the raw CO2 concentrations. But if we create a similar plot using the excess CO2 concentration, so those concentrations above the baseline, you can see we isolate the source much more clearly. We can see that the direction of elevated concentration points directly toward the known source. So this result and similar plots from other positions show just how useful using this excess concentration in the statistical methods is for isolating the most influential sources. Let's move over to the closest position, which is eddy position 4. Again, the excess plot shows that we have great detection ability with these elevated concentrations coming directly from the source. But we'd also like to be able to extract some quantitative results from this statistical plot. So the technique I used was identifying this maximum and its attributes. From this, we can extract both the wind speed and direction, as well as this maximum 95th percentile value recorded in the statistical plot. And so we can therefore see the directional error, or how far off we are from the source, as well as this proxy for estimating source size or source distance in the C95 max value, or the maximum 95th percentile concentration recorded in the statistical plot. So let's move back to position 1 at about 37 meters. And we can see here we have an increase in directional error, a decrease in C95 max. So this is a somewhat expected result. The further away we get from the source, the less influential it is on our detection equipment, and we aren't detecting the source quite as accurately. If we move to the third closest position, we can see we're actually still detecting the source direction fairly well. But eventually we reach a threshold where the station is too far away or obscured from the source to adequately detect it. So here we see that at position 2, which is about 60 meters away. Our 95th percentile technique does not identify the source, instead shows elevated levels coming from the east and the southeast. This can be explained by the bus stop here. You can kind of see it under the plot, where multiple buses are often idling, and so this is clearly a more influential source due to its proximity rather than the Panda Express bin. Okay, up until now, we focused on the eddy covariance tower. So let's take a quick look to see how this low-cost multi-station does. And in fact, we find that the multi-station shows similar performance in directional location ability and these C95 max values. This is an encouraging result because it shows that the techniques used here apply well to these low-cost sensor systems, and that having a simple anemometer, a cup and vein anemometer installed with GHG detection equipment could do well to identify nearby sources. So we've been focused on the directional location ability of each of these positions, but we've also been extracting this quantitative information from these statistical plots. And so now we can compare the distance from the source at each of our towers with this C95 max value, in addition, with the addition of the directional error for each calculation. So this exhibited trend looks pretty good. In general, as our distance from the source increases, the presence of those high percentile spikes becomes less influential, and we have a lower C95 max value. Additionally, we see the expected result that, in general, a closer distance to the source corresponds with a better directional location ability. We note the outlier here, which is multi-station number 2. And this station was located on a spot much higher above the roof than any other monitoring station. So we expect that this has something to do with the fairly skewed results there. All right, so we found that the distance of the tower and the C95 max value are correlated, great. But how about C95 max and the size of the source? So this is actually pretty easy to test because recall that we're concurrently monitoring this vent as we collect data from the towers. So using simple filtering on our entire data set, we can limit the plotted data to when the vent is emitting a certain range of values. Here we can see the bivariate polar plot from position 1 when the vent is completely off, so no CO2 coming out of the vent. And in this case, clearly the most influential source is coming down here from the south-southeast, which again could be explained by the presence of this bus stop here. Now let's see what happens when we turn up the mass from the vent. So at low levels of emission, we're still seeing influence from the bus stop. But as we increase the vent size, we can slowly see that our directional error is reduced, and the larger the source size becomes, the better we are at detecting it. So that's pretty cool. Here's a plot of the mass flow rate versus those C95 max values at eddy station 4, the closest one, with the directional error again. And this is another somewhat expected trend. As the amount of CO2 coming out of the vent increases, so does this C95 max value. And in addition, the larger the source size, the better our directional location ability in general. All right, so for the most part, up until now, we've been looking at CO2 as our GHG of choice. And this is because we recall we were directly measuring how much CO2 is coming out of that point source. However, we also know that the point source emits CH4, or methane, and it does so at much higher levels relative to the ambient background. So the background levels of methane are fairly low, but this vent is emitting quite high levels of CH4. And so the result of this larger relative source is that the detectability footprint using our eddy covariance tower is much larger for CH4. So you can see that here. Recall that at position 2, when we used CO2 as a tracer, we detected mostly this bus lane. But with CH4 as a tracer, we can effectively locate this source. We're pointing in the right direction. Great. If we move even further away to eddy covariance station 3, this is 83 or so meters away, and we're still detecting the direction of the source. Let's move over to eddy station 5, and here we see a really interesting result. So although this station is closer than the previous two, we see detection coming in this completely incorrect direction. Maybe there's another source over there. So if we take a look at this area of the roof, we can see in fact that yes, there is another source. There's another vent over there. While we did not explicitly measure this vent for CH4, we measured it for CO2 at the beginning of the experiment, and the levels were fairly low, but we weren't concurrently monitoring it. Our results here show that this source, this vent, is actually more influential at the tower than the Panda Express vent, given some combination of its size and distance. So this is pretty cool because we successfully located a source that we didn't know to be emitting methane before we started the experiment. So this result indicates that this highest percentile, 95th percentile method we've been using identifies the most influential source of pollution, which in this case is the CH4 coming from the other non-Panda Express vent. So we wonder then if there's some way to detect the less influential Panda Express vent despite having this more influential vent nearby. And to investigate this, let's enter the realm of probability and what are called conditional bivariate probability functions. So this very similar plot to what we've been looking at is calculated again by binning all data into wind speeds and directions. Then the 95th percentile for all concentration values is calculated, and the conditional probability is then calculated as the probability that a concentration value will exceed this 95th percentile threshold given the condition of its wind speed and direction bin. And so in this case, we see that there's about a 10% probability or so, given our data, that if the wind speed and direction is in this range right here, the concentration will exceed this 95th percentile threshold. Now, a really nice feature of using this technique is that we can actually use a range of percentile values instead of just an individual one like the 95th. So take this plot, for example, which is exactly the same as the previous plot you saw, but instead shows the probability of a concentration falling between the 85th and the 95th percentile, so a little bit lower than that 95th percentile we were seeing earlier. And if we line this up with our tower, we can see that by lowering the percentile to a range of 85th to 95th, we're actually detecting the direction of the source. Hooray! All right, so let's test this on a different position to make sure we weren't just getting lucky. Recall this plot, we've seen it before. This is the plot of excess CO2 at position 2, which is clearly showing us that the most influential source is the bus stop. If we use the CBPF using a threshold of 95th percentile, we're still getting the bus stop, as that's the highest percentile. But if we lower the percentile again down to the range of 85th to 95th percentile, while we're still detecting the bus stop to the east, we can now see that there is an elevated probability of concentrations falling in this range coming from where else but directly from the vent. And so this tells us that by varying the statistical thresholds, we can identify different, perhaps further away, less influential sources, which is a pretty encouraging result. Okay, clearly we have some pretty cool results out of these statistical methods and visualizations, but how about we jump into the buzzword of the day, machine learning, and see if we can quantify the event using it? Well, it turns out we actually have a really nice system to test this out on. But how would machine learning work in this application? So let's take a look. Here we have our CO2 data from the tower in blue, as well as the mass of CO2 coming out of the vent. This is what we want to predict. So the first thing we're going to do is scale everything using a basic min-max scalar to between 0 and 1 for consistency. And recall that we don't simply have CO2 data from the eddy covariance tower, but we have methane, CH4 data, and all of this wind data. So this looks pretty nasty. And our goal is to be able to predict the amount of CO2 leaving the vent using all of these variables collected from the remote tower. This looks pretty tough using just reasoning or logic, but this is where supervised machine learning really shines. So how do we use it? Well, the first thing we do is to split our data into independent sets, one for training the algorithm and one for testing the algorithm. So once we've done that, we can really let the machine learning algorithm do its thing. We're using what's called a long short-term memory or LSTM neural network to do this. These algorithms work by feeding in all of these variables into a hidden layer of neurons, which then attempt to create an output as close as possible to our measured or target data. This system is modeled after how we think brains work, with the algorithm learning how input data can be manipulated using relationships and weights in these hidden neurons to create the most accurate output data possible. So this is the training phase. Now, once we've trained this LSTM model, we can use it to test it on our holdout set. So to do this, we simply feed the input data into our LSTM model and see what it predicts given how the model was trained. So let's zoom in on this testing data. Here in red, we can see the actual empirically collected known mass flow rate from the vent. And here we see what the ML algorithm predicts. So obviously this is very noisy and on small time scales doesn't look very accurate. But if we apply a rolling average of an hour to both the observational and the machine learning data, we can see that in this situation, the algorithm actually does pretty well at detecting the broader trends of CO2 leaving the vent. Pretty cool. Furthermore, we can move if we move to a tower location a little bit further away, so Eddy Station 1, we can see the same noisy prediction from the ML algorithm. And the rolling average here shows that there's a general trend agreement, but clearly our error is higher due to the fact that we're further away from the source. Now, there's a lot more work that can be done to fine-tune these models and plenty of additional techniques to be implemented and explored, but I think this is a pretty good illustration of the potential of machine learning in these type of applications. Whew, okay, so let's go back to our original goal. We wanted to be able to characterize a hyperlocal point source using concentration and wind data, and we were able to do just that. We found that using statistical visualizations and machine learning, we can develop a good idea of the sources which influence each individual station. So what implications does this have, and what future work can be carried out to get us closer to accurate GHG characterization? Well, our results show that basic statistical techniques can help identify these sources, but there's great potential for extending these results and investigating different statistical techniques not addressed in the presentation. This is where the statistical model that we built is helpful, because we can quickly change many of these parameters and see how those changes affect our results and our ability to characterize the source. Furthermore, the machine learning techniques presented can be refined extensively. Additionally, combining machine learning ensemble methods with our statistical model could help us identify different parameter spaces and allow for better characterization on various time and spatial scales. Also, additional data would allow an algorithm to continually learn their surroundings. So using additional data to train an algorithm to identify patterns and outliers indicative of environmental GHG interactions. Additionally, we could extend this work into the CFD realm, which we just touched on at the beginning of the presentation. So here's a very, very rough model of the Union Roof using Quick, which is actually developed by University of Utah researchers in collaboration with Los Alamos National Lab. Using just basic wind inputs and source inputs, this model shows the general dispersion of CO2 from the source. Now, these forward models could be coupled with a machine learning algorithm and statistical inference to create synthetic data. And so we could imagine a system where a machine learning algorithm is not trained on empirical data, but rather trained on model data, such that the initial calibration and training phases occur before the sensors are even deployed. So what we can then imagine is a network of so-called smart sensors, with each sensor characterizing their own local areas using machine learning algorithms, site-specific CFD and synthetic data, and the basic statistical inference that we've presented. So each sensor could then contribute valuable hyperlocal scale information to the sensor networks. This would allow broader networks to characterize GHG flux regionally without losing as much information at the site scale. So all three of these fields can help inform one another. And I think the future of emissions detection, quantification, and climate change research as a whole depends on a mixture and a confluence of all three. I'd like to give a quick shout out to all of those who helped me along the way, with a special thank you to all those listed here, as well as everyone who helped me lug the tower and seemingly infinite sandbags across the Union roof back and forth. And I'll leave you all on this summary slide of what we covered today, and hope that you'll ask any questions that you have. But that's all I've got. So thank you.
Excellent, well done. I'll clap. Normally the audience would be clapping right now, and they probably are. Thanks so much, Aaron. Excellent, excellent presentation, excellent work. I think the next phase of the defense, sometimes we'll have a quote-unquote executive session with the committee, but I think given the format of this defense under these conditions, what we'll do is go ahead and open up for general audience questions and answers, and then what we'll do is move into a session just with you and the committee after that. So Rich, if I can ask you to help, looks like you may have already, looks like folks may already be unmuted. The first, folks can use, if you want to ask a question, you can click on Q&A. It's a small button, maybe, hopefully, in your version of Zoom on the bottom right, and you can type in a question there. In the short term, I see that Dr. Pawar from Los Alamos National Laboratory has raised his hand. So, Rajesh, I will unmute you, and I will attempt to unmute you.
Can you hear me?
There we go. You are. Please take it away.
Okay. Hey, Aaron, nice presentation, nice work.
Thank you.
I'm sure Brian must have mentioned to you when we were there, I wish there was Panda Express in the Union. Unfortunately, we had to deal with some other food. But in any case, so just wanted to get your thought in terms of, you touched upon the noise and information in noise. Any thoughts in terms of what kind of information you think you can get out of the noise that you have in the data? You can talk, specifically to your case. What else you could have gotten out of the noise, you think?
I think that's a great question, and it really is what this whole thesis is based on. So in general, what I found in most of my literature review was that you have most studies kind of filtering out this noise to some extent. A lot of them, they collect data at very fast data rates, but then tend to immediately average them. And so what my technique and what my thought is that if you have smaller scale or a shorter time scale data, what these intense concentration spikes that we can see are the information that they bring is indicative of the immediate surroundings. And so with relation to my project, I think that, or you could see that the way that the excess concentration was used allowed for better characterization of the hyperlocal point source. But I think in general, there's a lot more information to be extracted from these intense spikes, which seem to emanate from either very large sources or sources that are very close by. And so in the case of like the CH4 coming from position 5, for example, so this one, I'm anticipating that this source over here that we found isn't emitting nearly as much CH4 as the Panda Express vent, but because of its relationship to, or because of its how far away it is, we're actually getting we're getting detection from that distance based on the fact that those spikes, those intense concentrations, that noise is likely emanating from the turbulent eddies carrying this type of information or this concentration to the tower. And so this is where this noise is where I really think that machine learning has an application, because up until now, looking at all of this data is difficult just by the eye, but this is where machine learning does a great job of picking apart what all of this noise could mean. And so I think this is really the future of extracting information from noise like that. Does that answer your question? I kind of rambled a little bit.
Yes, it did. One thing you may want to think about, is can you look at the noise and try to understand a little more about not just the source characteristics, but also what else controls the concentrations that you are seeing, and if you can learn about those. And some of those would be, along the lines of what you said, the physics that you may not have captured in your understanding, conceptual understanding, or also other factors that affect how the concentrations evolve. And so one thing to maybe think about is, are there that kind of information that is actually in the noise that you can tease out? And of course, this is what I'm talking about is more along the lines of a PhD thesis, but some of those things would be worth thinking about as well.
So I think that where this thesis falls short a little bit, one thing that I didn't have the opportunity to really investigate is different signal processing techniques, and how using different signal processing to do exactly what you're talking about, identify what information could be extracted from this noise. I think those type of techniques would be really helpful in shedding a little bit more light on what's missing, or what we're missing from this highly noisy data set. So
yeah, I agree. And just one final comment, Brian, if you don't mind. Where you were talking about, in terms of how potentially you could apply this to, location around Salt Lake, right? And as you start bringing in these additional insights, what you're going to do is you're going to make your technique more robust, because, there are going to be site-specific things that, that of course, you can capture in the way you're talking about, but if you can pin them more and see how the relationship between noise and these other parameters, you could make your technique a lot more robust. So anyway, good work.
I agree. Thanks for your input.
Yeah, I'll chime in at this stage. Both Rajesh's question and your response, Aaron, really ties in well to Dr. Dubé's question. We'll actually start, and please keep that in mind, it's over in the Q&A section. Dr. Wei Jia asked a question first, so we'll move on to him, and then we'll move to the really what you started to allude to just now, Aaron, the both the noise and the data and the nature of individual sources, and then Rajesh's follow-up comment, which compels me to comment both on the CFD modeling, which Aaron carried out using the quick model. Much more as he found, and I'll let you elaborate, Aaron, in a few moments, but in such a noisy environment as this was carried out, perhaps it'll be really effective at typical CO2 storage sites, such as remote green sites and oil fields and the like that don't have as many structures involved and generally are flatter with respect to topography. So the trifecta of methods that Aaron mentioned, I think, will become really even more applicable. This is the student union roof and campus in general, because of all the additional sources, including buses, parking lots, people, etc. It's really, really noisy. So the relatively good performance of those machine learning methods that Aaron deployed, pretty encouraging, especially when it comes down to more characteristic archetype CO2 storage sites that won't be as noisy. That said, something that in the interest of time, Aaron's presentation did not lay out was the broader context of this, and that is for CO2 storage sites detecting leakage, but also general, characterization of emissions and carbon footprints, which generally rely on pretty loose estimates. This method, especially in this intense urban environment, will help refine those estimates of forecast carbon footprint a heck of a lot more quantifiably robust, let me put it that way. Boy, now I'm really sensitive to my grammar, because I know that Aaron has mentioned that his mom really focuses on his grammar, and she's gonna comment to you about farther and further. I know she will, because you used further quite a bit during the presentation. But in any case, I love to hear myself talk, so I'm going to mute myself and turn the question over to Wei. Wei, you or Aaron, you could read Wei's question and have him elaborate.
Sure. I can just read your question, Wei. You asked, you said, you quantified the error degree from the towers to the source. Is it possible to also quantify the distance, maybe just a range of error bars between the tower and the source? So let me see. Rich, can you unmute Wei, if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah.
Basically, what I think this question is asking is trying to identify the relationship between error given the distance of the source or the size of the source. And this was something that I grappled with constantly throughout this project, where the distance from the source, especially using these statistical methods, is it obviously impacts the how well we can detect the source directionally. But the problem with creating kind of a more general scheme for estimating error based on distance is the fact that if you had a constant source size, that would be an option. Or if you were in a position where you're in a generally homogeneous and fairly flat environment, that developing those relationships is much easier. But what we have in this situation is a fluctuating source size and different distances. And so what happens is a smaller source that's closer presents itself very similarly in the statistical data to a larger source that's further away. And so disseminating between source size and distance in terms of quantifying error becomes really difficult. And I'd love to hear any suggestions people have, because as I said, this is something that I struggled with for.
Yeah. Thank you for answering my question. Can you hear me?
Yep.
So I guess my question was more like, So in your work, you already know the location of the Panda event, but if we're going to apply that to a field, we will not be to know where the leakage will happen. So instead of in addition to the knowing the direction of the possible leakage, and if we can also know maybe we're like 100 meters or 50 meters away from the tower, that will be also helpful to locate that leakage. And also in your presentation, I think you basically touched that a little bit. You had multiple ethical towers and low-cost towers, and you had a plot of the, this slide. It had a distance versus the CO2 concentration, and also the degree error. I don't know if it's possible to use those data to do some additional analysis to find the relationship between the distance and also the CO2 concentration, and use that as a starting point, maybe for a future student, just to look at how we can use those data to find a possible distance between the source and sink.
Yeah, okay, I understand your question. So for those of you, Brian kind of touched on it. This work was spawned out of Dr. McPherson's work in carbon sequestration, where you have these big carbon sequestration fields, and the original goal was to be able to use these sensor towers to detect a leak in the sequestration field. So from a well bore or a fault line, something like that, primarily as a leak detection system. Now, if I understand Wei's question, he's basically asking, well, okay, if we put this system, great, it works well on campus where you know where the source is, but if we put this thing out in a field, you could reliably directionally locate the source, but how can we bring distance in as something that we're relating to the CO2 concentrations that we're seeing? And I'll reiterate that being able to do this becomes really difficult because of the fact that if there are two sources in one direction or in the same direction, one of them is small and close, and the other is large and far away. From what I've seen in the data that was collected here on campus, those two sources generally present themselves in a similar way in the data. And so I think there is potential for future work in trying to disseminate what data corresponds to what distance away the source is. But as of right now, I'm kind of at a loss for a way to do that without extensive field calibration using a controlled release or something like that. And so what my proposal for a situation like a carbon sequestration field would be to put out a network of a bunch of sensors, each with low-cost sensors with an anemometer, so that you have a network across the entire field such that a leak would be detected by multiple sensors, and then you would be able to compare that distance to concentration relationship using multiple sensors instead of just one, which using one tower to triangulate, or not triangulate, but to find a source's distance and size, that becomes really confounding. So future work to be done for sure. And that's a great question, Mike.
Yeah, thank you so much. Can I have also follow up on this slide? So in this slide, you show the direction arrow. You have the arrow ranging from 0.7 degree all the way to 228. So I'm curious, just within what kind of range you think that's a reasonable prediction?
That's a good question. I think probably perhaps in the 15 degree range. As soon as you start to exit that range, from what I've seen, so 89 degrees, 172 degrees. Obviously, 228 is a little bit, but I realize now that that's a little bit off because it's more than 180 degrees. But in general, I think if we're in about a 15 degree radius or angle of the source, I think that's probably reasonable that we're detecting the source that we think we are. And outside that, you get influence from other sources, and it becomes less likely that you're actually detecting the source that you think you are.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, let's move on to Dr. Dubé's question, please.
Let me actually, I'm on the phone. I can probably relate. Hey, good talk, Aaron. Like the focus so I'd like to, I'm more of an atmospheric scientist, so I'd like to have two questions. One is, were the two sources you had different methane to CO2 ratios? I know you may not have measured methane for the other one, but if they did have distinct methane to CO2 sources, and since they're both long-lived gases, this ratio will be preserved. That'll give you another constraint, so you can do the source attribution. So it'll give you another filter for your machine learning. And also a corollary question is, you are thinking of many sensors. So if you had upwind and downwind sensors, that gradient, and the directional information will provide you more information on isolating sources. So thoughts and ideas.
A question for you. When you say the two sources, I'm only dealing with one source, but you mean CH4 versus
CH4 and CO2. Yeah, the ratio.
Right. I mean, you had two sources, right? You had one big source, and then you said, "Oh, I have another smaller source." You had two vents that were confounding you now.
Okay, I see what you're saying. The source is, yeah, it emanates from the same thing. It's the same Panda Express vent. It emits both CO2.
Same. So it has the same composition.
It has the same composition in the fact that all of those emissions are coming out of the same source. However, let me see if I can find this plot quickly.
Yeah, while you're looking that up, Aaron, I think there's two issues. One is that both sources, both the Express and the Meyer that you discovered at running the stats, both emit, and Dubé qualified it up front by saying that you may not know the amount of, you went through an extensive analysis to evaluate exactly how much CO2 and CH4 were coming out of Panda, but you don't have that same information out of the smaller source in the other direction, and certainly not the ratios. So he's talking about the ratios of the two gases coming out of each individual source, and then also the gradients. So, sorry,
yes, I forgive me, I completely forgot about that other vent that we were detecting. That was at half of my talk. This source, yes, okay. I have almost no information about this source, and unfortunately, as soon as I found this result, maybe 2 months ago, I was eager to figure it out, but amid COVID, I can't really go and test the source for how much CO2 to CH4 is coming out of it. But I think this offers a great possibility of future research, because if you could do exactly what you're saying, monitor this source for CO2 and CH4 along with the Panda Express vent, and see how those different source sizes have, or what influence those different source sizes have on the detection ability, and what types of statistical methods and machine learning methods work best. I think that's a great possibility for future work. But to answer your question, I didn't have that information, but would love to have that information, because I think it would lend a great amount of new data to, or new methods to be able to disseminate between source size, source distance, directional location ability, etc. With respect to your comment about multiple sensors, upwind, downwind, I completely agree. So the way this project was framed upon my initial, or when Dr. McPherson initially gave it to me, was we want to be able to use one tower to be able to quantify this source. So basically the hardest version of the problem. But I immediately recognize the fact that if you have multiple stations, you can use the data at each individual stations to inform the other stations, or inform data at other stations. So absolutely, having an upwind downwind gradient would provide an even better means to isolate the source. Where I think this is where having a sensor network of many sensors being able to do these type of analyses would, if we can do it with one station, certainly having multiple on either side of the source would lend even more reliability to those source detection type work. So I completely agree.
Thanks, sir. So let me just follow up, not with a question, but some comments. The first is, this is a good time to be doing these kinds of activity. So Los Alamos, we actually applied this to a well pad. So there was an ARPA-E monitoring program, and we have a copyrighted software, and we focus on methane and ethane. So, if you have natural gas at a gas field, if there's a leak, and they actually are structures. So you have all these squirrels and other things. So CFD gets complicated. So we use a more sophisticated animal model called HiGrad, and we train the model using CFD simulations. What helps us here, and this is an applied problem, is in a city or a well pad, you'll kind of have some idea of where the leaks could come from. Because you have infrastructure information. That may not be the case for a sequestration site. So you can put a mask, and that's what we did. We combined infrastructure. This is the site where the squirrels and the elements were, and then we constrained using our methane and ethane measurements where the leak came from, and we trained it with a CFD model. Our performance was basically 95% success rate in finding a leak, and we tested it at a mock site, where there were blind tests. So
Sure.
the point is, this is a good field. I think the challenge is, and the opportunity is, to have people in machine learning like you and applied math kind of understand and work with people some of the other tools available. And by the way, the calibration at the site was key. To train a machine learning, you can have the model, but the complexity in the real world is so high that what you get from training by a calibration is much higher than you will get by any modeling. So I just wanted to throw that in because and I'll be glad to share a paper we have just submitted to atmospheric environment that talks about this application.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for your comment. I'd love to see the paper.
Okay.
And I think that, at least from the research I've done, I completely agree. What I found is that I can do a pretty good job, as is evidenced by this presentation, of characterizing this site very specifically. So I know what's going on at the site. Okay, we have the bus stop, we have these vents, but as soon as, and especially with respect to a machine learning algorithm, like you said, as soon as you enter a different environment, it's so complex that and heterogeneous that applying the actual algorithms and the statistical results to other sites really isn't an option. But instead, you would have to have site-specific trained algorithms using empirically calibrated machine learning techniques and statistical models that really represent their site. And so this is where I think that potential for these smart sensors that are basically characterizing their local areas based on site-specific assumptions would really be helpful. But as you said, in a city or in heterogeneous areas, all that kind of can tend to go out the window because of how complex it is. And it's easy to blame it on turbulence.
Do you happen to know somebody called John Lynn?
Yep.
Yeah, so he's been doing, we work with him, you know, we've been doing larger scale measurements, and John's a very good resource. He knows a lot about one of the world's experts on atmospheric transport, large scale.
Yeah, I actually work closely with, or I don't work closely with John Lynn, but I work closely with Ryan Bears, who actually has a question, is the next up in the queue, I think. And so,
nice
thanks,
segue.
yeah.
I've been working with those in the atmospheric science department somewhat, but I think that this research can apply to what they're doing, absolutely.
Hey, thanks, Dubé. Terrific question. Thanks for joining today, both to you.
Oh, pleasure. Thanks for inviting us.
Absolutely. Let's move on to Ryan. That was a really nice segue into Ryan's question.
Okay, so Ryan, if Rich wants to find Ryan and unmute him, I'll read the question out loud. I think you can all see it, actually. You said you're talking about the low-cost sensors. The gas hounds used in this analysis are relatively expensive. So those, the low-cost sensor tower used sensors that were about $1,000 to $2,000 per sensor, dollars per sensor, with a fairly good precision and accuracy. He asked, how would my results change if I were to use a true low-cost sensor, like a $100 sensor with an Arduino at plus or minus 10% parts per million? And could I also elaborate on the trade-off between accuracy and precision of sensors versus network density in a study like this? So this is a great question, and one that I am continuing to investigate. There's a short section of my thesis. I actually didn't cover it at all in the presentation. But what I was finding was that by using this excess concentration that I talked about at length, basically what I think happens here, and the reason that I think having or using this excess concentration where we're filtering off a baseline this baseline is calculated solely on the CO2 data itself. And so what I think that does is it tends to get rid of any of that sensor drift and inaccuracy, or not any of it, but it gets rid of a lot of that because we're comparing this excess concentration to values that are actually recorded by the sensor. So you can imagine a system where your sensor is reading 20 parts per million off, but if it's reasonably stable, even if you're 40 parts per million off on the actual raw CO2 concentration, by creating this baseline and then subtracting off an excess and using that to kind of fine tune our statistical models, that's where it does a really good job, because it kind of eliminates that bias of if you're off by a certain amount from raw CO2 values, and instead uses a relational or a relationship between the values that are collected and the broader trend in general. And so I think that if we were to really use this work in a system of sensor networks with regard to the precision and accuracy of the sensors versus sensor density, what I think we would find is that low-cost sensors perform as well as higher cost sensors if we're using them for source directional location and general kind of size quantification. With respect to the data rate, which is kind of another piece of the puzzle with respect to sensor precision, accuracy, data rate, network density, etc. I was finding actually that if I randomly filtered out lots and lots of the data values, I was still getting very good directional location ability and similar statistical maximums, that C95 max value. And so I think the trade-off between accuracy and precision in a network like this is, if your aim is to characterize hyperlocal sources, if you want to detect leaks or find the most important sources nearby, that using a low-cost sensor would do a pretty good job of this because of this excess concentration. But obviously there's tons more work that can be done with regard to the relationship between how accurate our sensors are, how precise they are, and how many sensors we would need in a network to adequately characterize a footprint around each sensor. I don't see Ryan anymore, or maybe he's on there.
Yeah, I'm still here. And I just like to note that Alex Turner has actually done some significant amount of work and published a paper in, I think, 2019, where he actually quantified that trade-off between network density and accuracy of measurements. So when you're thinking about applying this to larger scale leak detections, that's certainly a resource that's worth looking at.
Alex Turner.
Yes, so the Turner et al. 2019 paper.
Oh,
yeah,
I cited that paper.
Okay.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
So I do actually have one other follow-up question. Could you elaborate a little bit on how your baseline was calculated? Was it a first percentile over a 24-hour window, or what were the parameters on baseline calculations?
Sure. So what I used was, it was basically a version of a rolling minimum. Let me see if I can find the actual equation in a reasonable amount of time. Here we go. So it's a rolling, in essence is just a rolling minimum. And I chose that because I really wanted to focus only on what was above the very lowest values. The nice thing about the model that I've built is, so all of these plots that are generated, all of the statistical plots and everything is completely customizable. And so there is certainly more information that could be found by testing out a different baseline technique. I know that you and your group used a technique using like the first percentile or something like that on a 24-hour rolling window. So what I did was use I'm actually still investigating how different rolling windows affect our ability to detect a source, or what extra information we could extract. So for the sake of the presentation, what all of those plots that you saw were based on 10 minutes, a 10-minute rolling average. But once again, that model that we built allows for the quick change of, I want to see how using an hour rolling baseline or an hour rolling minimum has an impact, or a day, or 10 seconds, etc. And so that's where kind of all of these different scales and signal processing techniques of how much of a rolling average do we need, how much do we need to filter out, how much information can we keep in order to fine tune these models to best characterize the sources around them. And I'm happy to talk with you more about that if you'd like. So does that answer your question?
Absolutely, thank you much.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, thanks everyone. Any final questions for Aaron before we adjourn the broader defense, public defense, and move to a committee mode segment? Ben has a question. Ben, absolutely.
All right, Ben asks, could lessons learned from the LSTM approach here be applied at scale for any existing measurement networks? So what model features were the most important, and how would you approach hyperparameter tuning and uncertainty quantification? Great question. So the LSTM approach that I use, the machine learning the technique that I used was specifically a supervised learning technique. And so the issue with trying to apply this type of technique actually goes back to what Dr. Dubé was talking about with respect to this model was trained using the empirical data and specifically using a target array of known source values. And so we know how much CO2 is coming out of the source, and the LSTM that we're using is trying to figure out what to do with all of this wind and CO2 data in order to create the best output that most closely matches this target array that we're looking at. So with respect to scaling it to existing measurements or existing measurement networks, that becomes really difficult to use this technique specifically because unless you have input data, unless you have a network where you specifically have a source nearby that you're measuring and could train this machine learning algorithm on direct data, this is where the method falls a little bit short. But once again, this is where I think this confluence of using machine learning, I'll go to this slide, using machine learning coupled with forward modeling to try and create a forward model data set, a synthetic data set to help inform these machine learning models. That's where this could be scaled to networks eventually. What model features were most important, and how would I approach hyperparameter tuning? So I actually did some manual grid searching on the hyperparameter space, and so I looked specifically at things like the dropout rate, the number of neurons, let's see if I can find the actual stuff here. So activation rate, learning rate, decay, batch size, epochs, all of these different hyperparameters are what allow the model to be trained. And so I did do some manual grid searching on that to find the best parameters for given my very specific supervised learning model. But this is where work could really be extended more. And with respect to your question about uncertainty quantification, this is a question that still looms pretty large in my mind with respect to how, so you can see this plot here, which I showed, where we have these very noisy predictions. And the root mean squared error as reported by the model is 8.2%. Okay, well, what's the real meaning of what does this error mean and how does it relate to uncertainty? This question is one that I'd like to continue to address as I build my machine learning chops, because I think that it's still a little bit unknown to me how the tuning of hyperparameters and what exactly that error estimation is looking at, and how this uncertainty is directly quantified is an area for future research, both for me and anybody who picks up this research where it lives now. It's kind of a long-winded answer to your LSTM question, but did I answer it? Hopefully.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
Hey, Aaron, one last question. If you go to your results slide, the last plot of prediction versus measurement, you had a slide where you showed the machine learning prediction versus measurement. So is there do you do better at some size of leaks? If you look at as a fractional difference, are you uniformly good or bad across the leak rates, or is there some sweet spot?
With respect to the
performance,
yeah,
predicting the flux rate.
So I actually didn't look specifically into, that's actually a really good question that I would like to look into, is how the size of the source corresponds with my detection ability. I didn't look specifically at how well the LSTM does at predicting source size relative to the size itself. The only thing that I did find was the relationship between distance and predictability, which I presented. So here's the source where the tower is really close to the source and it's up above it. So it's detecting the source nearly constantly. And so the LSTM does a pretty good job here. And if we move further away, this is where things start to get a little hairy. And then even further away than this tower, the machine learning algorithm just looks like
and you can also see actually there's a time lag. So the farther you get, the blue is lagged, and that's just the transport time. So you can actually correct for these things physically.
So that's a great point. I actually added a parameter in both the statistical model and in the machine learning model where the data that's fed into the machine learning model is time lagged, but I didn't do a lot with playing around just based on how long it takes to train these models and the time I had at hand with how using a time lag could allow for better quantification or better results from machine learning, because I completely agree there clearly is a time lag here, which relates to, just like you said, the transport time between when X amount of CO2 is emitted from the source and when that plume is actually detected by the tower itself. So plenty more work to be done in that regard.
Yeah, but it's nice that you actually see the structure. You see the source go up and down and you pick it up, right? The oscillations are there.
Agreed. I'm pretty happy with how these results turned out.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, any other burning questions for you all? You can also ask me later. If you don't want to ask in front of everybody, that's fine. But I don't see any. Brian?
Just let's, if everyone could, I guess we can unmute everyone. You'll just have to, it's such a disappointment that this could not be live today, because it, having that visual, those visual cues from the audience are so worthwhile, and I'm certain that everyone online really appreciates the excellent presentation and the work that you committed to making this happen, because it's not just the presentation, but everything that went into building the science and the results. And great work. I think I speak for everyone, and there are some chat messages coming through expressing such. Again, any final comments, just feel free to raise your hand. Yep, multiple chat comments coming in. Congratulations, excellent work from Nate and from Dr. Arosa, from Brett, Rich, some bravos in there. It's Logan, great job, congratulations.
Well, let's not congratulate me just yet. I still have to get grilled by Dr. McPherson here.
As well as Dr. Rosa and Dr. Horrell. So
True.
Yes, indeed. And I might also add, in addition to all the compliments you're receiving from the audience, just that while it is a disappointment that we could not carry this out live, I think you've made the most of the medium. It's one of the better web broadcasted presentations, truly, overall. Rachel?
Well, thanks for your kind comments, and to everybody as well. Thanks for attending and being a part of what I've done for the last 2.5 years. Condensed 2.5 years into half an hour. presentation, not bad.
Not bad at all. Actually, excellent, truly excellent. So, all right. And then also from Sarah, Logan, Alec. Excellent, everyone. Thank you so much. And Thomas Meyer also expressed congratulations earlier, and he also expressed something that I think is a great sentiment, and that is that your presentation conveyed not just to the scientists in the audience, but to the lay persons as well, the lay people as well. So it's well done. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. What we'll do is take a 3-minute break and give the audience, the broader audience, a chance to chime in. We'll basically, Rich and I will work on unmuting everyone so that there can be a few minutes to talk kind of roundtable, and we'll give the panelists a chance to take a small break and make any final notes that they want to take. And so let's begin the committee-only session at 11:35. So cue up your watch, and everyone's well on their way to being unmuted. And if I could ask the broader audience, just 11:35, we will adjourn the public presentation and move into a committee discussion with Aaron. Thanks again, everyone.
So Brian, quickly, I think I'll make you host and I'll drop off so you have full control for the panelists.
Sounds good.
All right. Well done, Aaron. Great job.
Thanks, Rich. And thanks for coming, everybody. It was great to have you along. Fun presentation for me. And I'm glad that you all were able to join. I think this is a pretty cool. I mean, it would have been nice to do it in person, but I almost think this is better because I can allow everybody from all corners of the U.S. to be able to join. So thanks for your support and your kind comments. Much appreciated.
Hey, Aaron, Brett here. I just wanted to say congrats. That was a great talk, and it's such a pleasure working with you. That was really a good time.
Thanks, Brett. For those of you who don't know, Brett really held my hand through my figuring out how to use this CHPC, which is a high performance computing center at the University of Utah. I frantically scrawl emails at 10 p.m. to Brett saying, "Oh, this isn't working," and he helped me through it immediately. So thanks to you, Brett.
Oh, my pleasure, dude. My pleasure.
Hi, Aaron. This is your Aunt Louise. I'm very impressed with your presentation. My goodness, I didn't understand a lot of it, but I am so impressed. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Baksha. I'm glad that we were able to get you on from Wisconsin. Pretty great use of technology to have you be able to see me give this presentation. So thanks for your kind words. Much appreciated.
Okay, I have to take the iPad.